Well, let's first talk about how long you've been a part of ACSP and what your earliest memories of it are.
Aha, okay. So my first ACSP conference was just after I started teaching at Florida State. It was 1984 in New York at the Milford Plaza Hotel, where these hundreds of planning scholars show up and start talking about things that I think are fascinating, and I'm just amazed. The Milford Plaza had these tiny, narrow little corridors, and it was not a great conference venue physically. The corridors were so tiny that if two people were talking to one another, a third one couldn't slip by. You had to make people move to get by. And so you'd be close to the conversations that were going on as you moved through them, and I was just fascinated at what people were talking about and the enthusiasm for planning scholarship. It was a really great exposure to the association and to what people were trying to do here.
So cool. I love to hear about the earlier conferences and then what it looks like today. When were you president? When you were coming in, what did you want to accomplish, and then what do you consider your biggest accomplishment?
Aha, okay. So I was president 1999 to 2001, and I think the association had gone through a period of trying to stabilize its finances and its budget just before my presidency. There had been Sandy Rosenblum and Eugenie Birch in their years had done a great deal to get the association's finance and organization in shape. And so I came in with the luxury of being able to think about more substantive kinds of interventions. But what we hadn't done is become a legal entity. And I discovered this rather accidentally. We had an IRS 501c3 status, and so we assumed we were incorporated. We thought we were incorporated in Michigan because that's where the 501c3 paperwork had been done. It turns out we weren't. We'd been operating for decades as a club without legal status. And so one of the things that I knew was important was that we set in motion the process to become an incorporated entity. And that didn't happen until I think it actually happened during the Chris Silver presidency, 3 years after mine. But we started the process then. And one of the big pieces of that was doing a new set of bylaws, which were enacted while I was president. So that's sort of the organizational side. But on the substantive side, we were balancing two roles that I expect you're hearing from a lot of people about. The first role is an association of schools, which is how we began in the 1950s. And the second role is a learned society, which is a role we took on for ourselves, or they took on for themselves in the late 70s, early 80s, when the conference was born and the journal Planning, Education, and Research was born. And I thought we had needs on both sides of that balance sheet, we were not, for instance, doing much for young scholars formally at the time. And I had been to one of the ASOP PhD workshops in Europe and had heard people rave about the ASOP PhD workshop and what that accomplished for them. And I took that idea and tried to sell it to our executive committee and bring that idea here. And we, in fact, did that. Jen Giuliano at Southern Cal hosted the first ACSP PhD workshop on Captiva Island, I believe, off the Southern Cal coast. It was a great success and has now taken place, I think, every year since then. So that was a first initiative. Second initiative was about our interaction globally. And again, I came in the middle of a series of decisions that had been made over years. We started in 1991, we had a joint conference with ASOP in Oxford, and in 96 we had a joint conference with ASOP in Toronto. And in Toronto, the idea was hatched to have a global conference, a World Planning Schools Congress. And that occurred during my presidency in Shanghai. So we had this first World Congress while I was president. And I thought that this was a great opportunity to try to imagine what else we could be doing together as planning schools around the world. And so I initiated a process to try to bring the leaders of any planning school association we could find globally together in Shanghai and talk about our experiences, our objectives, what we might be able to do together. And in Shanghai, we signed something that became known as the Shanghai Statement, where we had 10 planning school associations that signed the statement at the closing ceremony in Shanghai, and we committed to doing another World Planning Schools Congress 5 years later, and to building a communication network for the associations to talk to one another. That led to a meeting in Volos, Greece in 2002, where the Global Planning Education Association Network was created. And so I'm in the middle of a process and moving it forward and trying to make it successful. It started before me, it ended after me, but I think our years were important in moving that global conversation.
So what would you like to see for ACSP accomplishing in the future, as we move forward? So for instance, we went from a one full-time employee to now we have 5 almost full-time employees within a year and a half, 18 months. That's a big change. It's a big adjustment for the internal structure of the daily management for ACSP, right?
Sure.
What do you want to, as we grow, what do you want to see ACSP accomplish? What do you think is in need of change to make that growth continue?
So, I think
Just real quickly,
Yeah.
is that more comfortable? Because
Am I better back off? Okay,
yeah,
sure.
The audio, it's not getting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me just get you in frame.
So yeah, in the video, you won't even hear me asking the questions.
You're
gonna see a version of the question. It may just be text or whatever. So yeah.
Sure.
So to be, I think you'll be surprised when you see the actual final product. Okay, so the future accomplished change, what?
So ACSP has rightly been focused internally on the Planning Academy and on helping scholars advance their careers, helping communication between scholars, supporting schools, thinking about the structural issues of the schools and helping schools imagine what to do about those. But we've really had a very modest external agenda. We're not a presence in Washington in policy circles. I would be very surprised if anybody at the Department of Education knows we exist and what we stand for and what we think about. We haven't been active in building funding streams to support planning work. And I think the organization is strong enough at this point that it ought to be turning its gaze outward and thinking about how to influence national educational policy, teaming up with other learned societies to try to influence what NSF does and what the Department of Education does, and making arguments for why planning scholarship is valuable to different potential clients and building streams of funding that could then become available to planning scholars. So I'd like to see us turn our gaze outward and start to be more aggressive in promoting planning scholarship and advocating for planning scholarship.
Do you see a PAC future?
Do I see a
Political action committee? Just out of, this is just me asking.
Yeah, no, so I don't think about it in political terms.
But if we want a presence in Washington, if we want, really for people to know about our agenda, we would need someone pretty full-time fighting that fight.
So
eventually.
So a lobbyist, yes, but a political action committee, no. I think this should be done in a bipartisan way. I don't think we should be affiliated with a party and be seen as close to one candidate's political agenda or another candidate's political agenda, but rather as expertise offered to the decision-making structures to help them understand issues better and interpret issues better so that they make judicious decisions about planning education and the way planning develops.
Yeah. I bet that's Lois leaving. Hi, Lois. Hi, Lois. Do you want him to talk about
Yeah,
Just
if you don't
relax.
mind, because it was pretty.
that? It was pretty loud. I know. Did you see my eyes? I went,
Yeah.
Okay, so.
You want me to
it was
back
the
up and-
difference between lobbyist and PAC.
So, I mean, I don't think of this in political terms. I think of it as we're technical experts who can offer advice to the policymakers in Washington, both in the administration and in the legislature. And we want to do that in a nonpartisan way that that doesn't get us pegged as being affiliated with this or that candidate or party, but as a source of good information, good analysis that can help the decision makers make good decisions.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree with that. There does seem to be a lack of knowledge publicly. So if you're in the industry, you know the ins and outs, and but me as some newbie, I didn't really know what planning was, especially when I was interviewing for the job. I was trying to figure out what it was. And so I watched the video on the website.
Uh-huh.
And very creative, told me exactly, like once they said it, I was like, oh, I know now, I know what planning is. And then, but the difference between research and academic planning versus the practical or in practice planning, very different. So even that, helping them understand the difference, because I don't think people understand that a lot of thought goes into where do you put a bridge, where do you put a bike lane, where do you put a sidewalk, where do you put everything, a bus stop.
So as you're talking, you're making me think that a continued important priority for the association, I think, has to be our relationship with the practice world. And ACSP has been wonderful in helping to build a scholarly branch to this profession. But as many people recognize, the scholarly branch has found some of its own directions that don't tie to the regular practice of the profession. And the way we as scholars think about the profession tends to be somewhat different than the way many professionals think about the profession. And bridging that divide, helping the two sides to understand each other better, to be more responsive to each other, it continues to be a very important objective that I think ACSP absolutely has to pursue.
Yeah, and I'm still learning, and so hearing about what you guys as academics do versus, I think the practice side is easier for a consumer to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're in academia, and then you kind of have an understanding. And I have some friends who are PhDs and do research in psychology, so I have a tiny bit of, okay, so this conference is like what her, I think it's ABT conference that they go to for psychology, that's her big one she goes to. Students present papers, and so I have a tiny bit of knowledge. But yeah, I think that will help that communication between the practice world and the academic world.
And many of us, most of us, want our scholarship to be relevant to practice. We want practitioners to pay attention to what we write about. We want them to follow the lessons that our scholarship open up. But knowing what the issues are that will make a difference in the practice world and that will move practitioners to act is sometimes very difficult. And fostering a conversation that helps the scholars understand the research needs of the practitioners is a very important thing.
Good. All right, last thing. Anything you want to say to potential watchers of the video?
I think this is a remarkable organization. I mean, with very little resources and with the energy of a dedicated core of people now over, it's what, 40 years since we got serious about being a learned society, but maybe we're going close to 70 years of existence as an organization. We have built a discipline in this country that has tremendous impact on the society around us and globally. And it's the result of dedicated effort by many people over many years who believe in a mission and a purpose. And I think that's remarkable. And I'm really proud to have been part of it.
Cool. That's good.